Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 21st of August. Today we're going to do a full frontline update. We're going to begin by looking at Robotyne, then we're going to go to Klishchiivka, then we'll go to Kupyansk, and then we'll talk about the F-16 deliveries. Well, let's first look at what's going on around Robotyne. And in this area, I'm recording at a time where there are a lot of initial reports that are really coming out about changes to the front lines, which can't be confirmed yet. So I'm going to be very cautious with how I word everything and how I sort of designate the front line on the map. But I will try to give a accurate depiction of what's going on. So over the past 48 hours, Ukrainians have been able to advance deeper into the town, into the village of Robotyne. So you could see at the beginning, or like in my last video, the Ukrainians had positions in the northern outskirts of the village. And since then, they've been able to expand their control further and further south. So now they also have positions that are within the village center. So the southern part of the village is now more so the gray zone. The gray zone has shifted from the center of the village to the southern parts. And the Russians, they have already started to withdraw from the village. They haven't finished withdrawal, I believe. There's no indication that they have yet, although there are initial reports coming out from the Ukrainian side that they have. But once they do fully withdraw, and at the moment I still have them in the southern outskirts over here, once they do withdraw, they will be falling back to this trench line over here, which is located on a local height. So that will be their fallback line. So the main units involved in this Ukrainian push, and we've talked about this before, but it includes the 46th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades. It also includes the 15th National Guard Brigade. Those are the three main units involved in these operations at the moment. And not just in Robotyne, but also on its eastern flank over here. So on the eastern flank, you have the 3rd Battalion of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. They have moved in two armored personnel carriers. They're strikers. They moved in two new strikers into this area and dismounted infantry over there. And they launched a new assault. And in that new assault, they were able to secure additional control over the fields on Robotyne's eastern flank. So generally in this area, they were able to take over some new territory, which they previously did not have control over. And this also gives them control of some of the local trench systems that were previously under Russian control. So these can now be turned into Ukrainian fortifications and be used as new forward positions for the Ukrainians as they try to push deeper and deeper through these fields. Also, the Ukrainians have have a full control over this forested area over here. For a while, it was contested, but I just want to clarify that this afforestation over here is now under full Ukrainian control. And so, yeah, the Ukrainians are making some progress in this direction, albeit after weeks of heavy fighting on the northern outskirts of the fields, for instance. Most of the heavy fighting occurred over here, where I'm drawing this line, and also on the northern outskirts of Robotyne. That's where most of the heavy fighting occurred. And once the Ukrainians were able to break through those areas, the intensity obviously was still high, but the amount of time that it took to advance obviously increased because the main concentration of defenses was north of all of these villages. Now, looking forward, because we do have to look forward, we can't just have this like myopic view of the situation, only looking at what's going on right now. We have to look a little bit into the future. The Russians, as I said before, they're falling back to this line over here. Now, what are the Ukrainians going to do at that point? Well, I can't say for sure, but given the fact that the Ukrainians are still advancing on the eastern flank of Robotyne, it does seem like they do want to push in that direction and continue to take over the open fields in that area. And that does seem like a good solution because attacking head on towards the fortifications over here from Robotyne towards the fortifications to the north of Novoprokopivka will be extremely difficult. The Russians over here have the high ground, their trenches, and I'll zoom in on it so you guys get a better idea. The trenches in this area are located on a hill that overlooks the center of Robotyne. Center of Robotyne would be over here. So the Russians do have a very good fortified position. The Ukrainians may try to flank it by attacking through the eastern flank and then from there trying to dislodge it. That's also going to be extremely difficult, but it does seem like a better solution than attacking head on. At the same time, if we look out at the broader map around Zaporozhye, I just want to remind everybody that it's very hard to pinpoint what exactly is considered a first line of defense because when you think of a first line of defense, you probably think of the line that's the closest to the line of contact. And if you look at the trenches over here that I have mapped, they're all in these green lines, so you can see them. you don't have that many unified huge lines. There's only two main ones that you could see over here. You have this one over here, which is like 10 kilometers from the front line, depending on where you're measuring it from. And then you have this other one, which is closer to the rear and closer to major cities like Tokmak and Ochiru. And Robotyne, there are trenches over there, but they're not really connected to anything unified. You can see that there are plenty of trenches that the Russians have set up and plenty of defenses that are not exactly connected to other defenses. And that's just because they're all local defenses that were built up on a smaller scale to defend a more localized point. And so you can't really call it a single unified first defensive line, but they're all located at a similar distance away from the line of contact. So technically, if you're going by that definition of what's closest to the line of contact, you could say the Ukrainians have been able to break through the first defensive line, but really the number order of it doesn't really matter that much. It just matters that they broke through a certain trench, and at this point they have been able to break through some of them. And if you look at the scale, they are pretty small in comparison to the ones that Ukraine still does have to break through in the future. And when we look at the nearest target would be the trenches that are just to the south of Kupyasnsk or around Verbove. So those, if you look into the future in this area around Orikhiv, around the Orikhiv axis, those would probably be the targets for the future. And the way that Ukraine would go about assaulting these towns, that's still unknown, but it's going to be very difficult to assault them head on, just like it was difficult to assault Robotyne head on because of the trenches to the north of it that were actually pretty small in size. So you didn't have that many men stationed over there, and it wasn't that wide in terms of the width of these defenses. Then look at the defenses around Verbove and around like Solod Kabalka. It's going to be very difficult as well, just given the fact that those defenses are so well prepared and so extensive compared to the ones around Robotyne. And when we look at Ukraine's potential reinforcements, a lot of the mechanized brigades that they had at their disposal before the counteroffensive have already been committed. I'll actually show you guys a tweet that I wrote that goes over this. So I looked through every single Ukrainian mechanized brigade that we are aware of, and I found its location, and here I have a list of all of them. I'm not gonna like read through every single thing over here because it's not that important. You could look through it yourself. It's linked in the description. But what I'll say here is that there are 43 mechanized infantry brigades which I was able to pinpoint that I know of their existence. Maybe there are some other ones in reserve that haven't been publicly announced yet. That's something that I have no idea about. But of the ones that we know about publicly, there's 43. And of those 43, I was able to find out that about 37 of them have at least some elements that are fighting on the front line. And when I say some elements, I mean that they have at least one mechanized battalion that's fighting on the front line, because they can't go around looking for each battalion. That would be extremely difficult because there's 3 battalions in each mechanized brigade. But we know that at least some elements of 37 brigades are at the front line, which leaves 6 in reserve. There's only 6 mechanized brigades left that are in reserve. And that means that Ukraine doesn't have that many more reinforcements, at least mechanized reinforcements, because we know that all of the crux of Ukraine's counteroffensive in this area around Zaporozhye was built upon the idea that there would be a mechanized advance that would be able to be a spearhead through some of the fortifications in this area. And a lot of those mechanized units, they were meant to be like exploitation brigades that would be able to exploit some sort of breakthrough that an earlier unit was able to achieve in order to make these quick, more successive gains using their mechanized columns. But due to the fact that a lot of these units, they were unable to break through at the beginning, instead of being used as exploitation forces, a lot of these units, like the 82nd Brigade, which is not a mechanized brigade, it's an air assault brigade, but either way, the point still stands, they were moved in to help break through the lines at Robotyne in order to allow for an exploitation opportunity. So now there's only really 6 brigades that we know of left that could be involved in any sort of future attacks in this direction around Zaporozhye. And remember that the Ukrainians also have other commitments besides the commitments in Zaporozhye. I'll just give you guys an example. There's plenty of units that I have listed over here that are stationed around the Luhansk front. And obviously, you're always going to have some amount of units that are stationed on different parts of the front line. But a lot of these units were very recently moved to the front line. Previously, they were in reserve. and then they were just moved to Luhansk, and they were just created at the beginning of this year in 2023. So it seems like a lot of them were probably supposed to be moved to Zaporozhye to help with that counteroffensive, but due to Russia's offensive activities and their attacks on the front line over there, they had to be moved to hold a line around the Luhansk front. And there is a lot of examples of this. There's probably like 3 or 4 that I have listed over here on this tweet, so you guys could see that for yourselves in the description. But that's really it for Robotyne. Let's move on to the situation around Klishchiivka. So now moving on to the situation around Klishchiivka. In this area, the front line really has stabilized due to the Russians sending in a lot of their reinforcements, especially LPR units, but also from the VDV. And they've, as a result, been able to counterattack on a local scale and have been able to retake some of the areas in the southern part of Klishchiivka, although it is still contested. But regardless, the fighting has become more positional in this region. But the Russians, they still do have the threat of Ukraine controlling the heights that overlook Klishchiivka. This is a major issue for the Russians at the moment. The Ukrainians, they still control all of these heights over here. You can see them overlooking Klishchiivka. And the Russians, they tried to at least take back some of them. For instance, there's this one height over here, which I've circled. This is a local hill that has this massive trench perimeter as well. So it's a very good area to have under your control as a firing point and also as a fortified position. And currently the Ukrainians control it, and it's very close to Klishchiivka and is used as a firing position onto Klishchiivka. So the Russians, they attempted to try to retake this height, presumably based on what we saw in the video, which I have linked on my map. And you can see in the video that the Russians, they sent in from the northern flank of Klishchiivka 3 tanks and 3 BMPs to try to break through towards the heights that Ukraine controls. And this is understandable because this is one of the areas that is less fighted. There's less fighting on the northern flank of Klishchiivka, for instance. So it could be a good area to attack through, to take back some land. And it's also important to try to neutralize the Ukrainian advantage by allowing them to have the high ground. So taking it back is important. So this attack, it was spotted by the Ukrainian drones, and then the Ukrainian artillery was able to destroy 2 of the BMPs and 2 of the tanks. And there was also landmines in the region, which also contributed to some of the destruction. And this was all done by the IDAR battalion, which is a unit that the Ukrainians are using to attack and also now defend on the sector. And so for now, the front line has remained the same, with Ukraine controlling the heights. Now moving on to the Kupyansk front. In this region, the Russians have been able to make minor gains since my last video. They were able to take over these open fields over here that I'm going over right now. You could see that's the land they took. They were also able to reach the ditch line that I was talking about in my previous video. I'll mark it for you guys over here. This is a local ditch line which the Ukrainians were using as a defensive position against the Russian advance. And now the Russians have been able to dislodge the Ukrainians from this forward defensive position and take it over themselves. So now the next Ukrainian line, based on this map, you could see it would probably be over here, and it would be defended by multiple different brigades, but the one that's very interesting is 67th Mechanized Brigade. And this sort of alludes to my previous point about some of these mechanized brigades being moved to hold a line around the Luhansk front. Now, there are some unconfirmed reports, and I'm just gonna say that you guys should exercise some caution because it's still very unconfirmed that the Russians have been able to take Sinkivka, which is why I've not changed my map yet, because this is only coming in from some of the smaller Russian Telegram channels, and so you're gonna have to wait for more confirmation before making a conclusive sort of statement about it. But for now, I'm still leaving it in the gray zone. And speaking of unconfirmed reports, there was actually this article by RIA Novosti, Russian media, and they leaked these documents, and this is what they said. They said that they were able to obtain documents from the Ukrainian regional administration in Kharkiv, and that the documents basically, they had preparations for the evacuation of 68 settlements that are on the border between Russia in Belgorod Oblast and the Ukrainian settlements in Kharkiv Oblast. And this would mean that there would be evacuations in 4 different rayons, or like regions within the oblast. And this is again being released by a Russian media outlet, so you really can't take it at its word. You have to take it with a grain of salt, obviously. But that's what they're saying, and it could obviously be a Photoshop. But it would be interesting if it was true, and we'll be able to see in the future if this report is true, because we'd see the Ukrainians beginning to announce the evacuation of the 68 settlements that are along the border with the Belgorod Oblast. And the reason why Ukraine would do that, it could vary. It could be because they want to send in new forces to that area. It could be because of increased shelling. It could be due to a fear of a Russian attack in that area. But first, we have to see if these reports are actually true. And same thing with unconfirmed reports of Russian attacks on bridges that are across the Oskil River. There are Russian sources reporting that there was a destruction of a bridge across the Oskil River. It could have been a Russian attack or a Ukrainian sabotage of the bridge. But again, that's still unconfirmed, so I can't even say that that's true. But if that were true, it would be this bridge over here or a bridge a bit to the north, because those are the two main crossings that the Ukrainians have been utilizing across the Oskil River. Now let's move on to the situation regarding the F-16s. So the breaking news that really started circulating 3 days ago is that Denmark and the Netherlands, they got approval from the United States to send their F-16s to Ukraine. So this is pretty interesting. We've been waiting for a while now to see whether NATO countries would actually send F-16s to Ukraine. And now this announcement has come from specifically Denmark and Netherlands. What Denmark is saying in terms of a time frame for how many will be sent and when is that they're hoping, at least, so this obviously could vary depending on what actually ends up occurring, but their goal is to send 6 F-16s to Ukraine by the new year in 2024. They want to send 8 more throughout the year of 2024, and then 5 more throughout 2025. So that's the Denmark's goal. Then Netherlands, they didn't really give a number as for how many they want to send and when they want to send it. But the caretaker prime minister of the Netherlands, he said that it's going to be a long-term commitment. And his own words, so it's not my words, but what he was saying is that it would take more than 1 month, which is pretty obvious. But regardless, Netherlands, they have 42 F-16s. Only 24 of them are operational. The 18 that are unoperational, most of them are probably in good condition, as 12 of them were slated to be sold to this company called Draken International, and it was supposed to be used as Red Force in pilot training. So for that to be possible, for those F-16s to be used as Red Force in pilot training, they would have to be in pretty good condition. And so those 18 F-16s that are not operational at the moment, those could probably be sent to Ukraine as well. But some of them are probably not in good condition. Those ones could probably be used as spare parts for any sort of damaged F-16 throughout the course of the fighting. And that's if they end up getting sent in time before the war is over. Because, some of these are going to be sent in 2025. That's in 2 years. That's a very, very long-term commitment. Now, the reason why it's taking so long is due to the infrastructure of sending it to Ukraine. It's also due to the fact that you need to train all these Ukrainian pilots. And in terms of the training aspect, you only have 6 Ukrainian pilots that have even started training, plus 2 reservists. And they haven't even started the combat training. What's going on now is that they're taking an English course. Even though all 8 of the pilots are fluent in English, they need to have a 4-month course in the UK to learn about all the English terminology relating to these F-16s. And so that's going to take 4 months plus the 6 months of combat training. So the time frame that was stated by Western officials and all these mainstream media articles, that would be the F-16s would finally see combat, or at least be sent to Ukraine for pilots that are already trained by around summer of 2024. So that would be in about a year. And so again, this is very long term, and only having 8 pilots at most that are trained with these F-16s, that's really not enough for the large scale amount that Denmark is going to send and that Netherlands is going to send at some point. So there's going to be more and more training for additional Ukrainian pilots. And then you also have to have some pilots that remain in Ukraine that can be trained because they're using the Soviet planes because they signal to fight in the war. And all those aspects need to be taken into account. It is going to take a while. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.